Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of JK's Garage. So, on this episode, I've met quite an interesting individual. He goes by the name of Zorro. And what stood out to me about Zorro was that he likes cars just like everyone else. And with that, in conversations that I had with Zorro previously, Zorro mentioned to me that he has had driven quite a number of cars in his time, together with own quite a number of interesting vehicles. And with that, we have Zorro.
Hi everyone. Hey Junaid, how you doing?
Yeah, man, all good, all good. Yeah, here in sunny SA, nice and humid and warm. How are things on your side?
Absolutely bloody freezing in the UK. Take me back to the Middle East. I'm heading back there next week. So I live in Dubai now,
Yeah.
predominantly, but yeah, at the moment in London, and it's very, very cold.
Okay, yeah, that time of the year. So cool. Zoro, so for the viewers out there, so if you can just help us understand pertaining to where your love of cars came into play, and what made you go out there and purchase or drive so many cars up to date.
Okay, so in order to answer this question, I think I need to give you a bit of context into my background. So I grew up in the north of England in a quite a poor, grey, kind of miserable area in Lancashire, near Manchester, for those Brits out there who know Lancashire. And I grew up quite poor. I had quite a poor family. I left home quite young in a council estate or welfare estate, where we cash in checks and such. So I'd never really been in a car until I was like, I don't even remember really in my early years ever being in a car, owning a car, or anything like that. And I remember because I was a naughty child. I became a little bit of a bad boy, when I was a young child in the wrong crowd, as you do. Some of the older boys used to buy cars illegally in the UK. Rather than seeing it as a sign of freedom and actually seeing it as a status symbol, a car was status. And of course, it gives you the freedom to explore, go to different areas. So I remember seeing some of these older boys with the cars back then, things like Vauxhall Novas, if you remember them, Ford
Yeah.
Mondeo ST24s, Ford Escort Cosworth, them kind of cars. That was my era in the mid to late 90s, early 2000s. And I remember seeing them cars, and it wasn't so much, the spec or anything. It was more how they looked and the status of the person driving them. So I think my love of cars began then, seeing the older boys buying cars and stuff. So, and of course, came with that, going on joyrides and such, came with that opening up the world to see different areas. I didn't even know the world was that big because in my little world, we had our little council estate, our little town. And as soon as you get in a car, open up the whole of the world. We have other towns and cities. And back then in the early days, pre Google Maps and such, you relied on stories, you relied on basic maps. And so the idea of the world opening up with this vehicle, with this machine that could take you there was amazing. So soon after, at the age of 14, I actually bought my first car.
So I'm a bit mind blown with that because I mean, at the age of 14, I mean, here in South Africa, you've got to be 18 to get your license. How, help me understand, how did that translate in the UK? I mean, how firstly, I mean, a 14-year-old to go out and buy outlay cash. How? I mean, just help me understand that.
Yeah, so let me tell you the story. That'll probably help again to give you the context. Um, I, like I said, I wasn't a great child. I was a little bit of a bad boy, got into a bad crowd, did bad things, and made money, right? Essentially illegally. So it was all illegal, and I do everything above board now, but this is very very young, long time ago. So I remember the first car I drove actually was my older brother's car. So when I was around the age of about 13, my brother was 18 or 19, and he just bought his first car, a Vauxhall Corsa, which was lovely, black. He had the whole black body kit. He went really, really crazy with it. And I wanted to learn how to drive a car. So seeing all the older boys, and it was a manual. So I pestered my brother, can you take me out on a car park and can you teach me to drive? He said, no problem. And so he took me to like a local supermarket car park. After about half an hour or so, I pretty much got it, right? Clutch, bite, okay, I'm good to go kind of thing. And I remember he didn't want me to go out the car park, but I drove out the car park and started driving on the main roads like a lunatic, and he was terrified. Kept saying, pull over, and I just kept going and going because I just felt like I got it. It was just in me. I'm quite handy. I've got good hand-eye coordination, so I pick up things quite quickly. So for me, I thought, oh well, this is easy. After about an hour of driving, I thought I'd go by my own. But as you said, at 14, number one, I didn't have a license, of course, and number two, it was illegal, and it still is illegal. But I remember there was this chap around the council estate, like someone's dad, who was a bit dodgy himself and was basically like saying, "I've got this kind of banger, this Fiat Punto." I think it was a 1 liter or 1.1 liter, first generation, I guess 1992 black Fiat Punto. I'll never forget that because it was the first car I owned. It was awful, a bit bashed up, blah blah blah. But the guy didn't care how old I was, and I can't even remember where I signed the documents and such too. All I remember is handing him over a lump of cash and jumping in the car, going to reverse out the driveway, but I'd never reversed a car at that point because I'd only driven for an hour forward. So as I was reversing out, I forgot to look the opposite direction and I actually scraped his fence, reversing that car out of his drive. I remember him leaning into me, going, "Are you sure you can drive, kid?" I was like, "Yeah, don't worry about it." And I just drove off, and I never looked back. And since then, from the next couple of months, I was off driving, doing missions to towns like Blackpool and Liverpool and Manchester, all these bigger cities and towns. And yeah, the whole kind of world opened up to me at 14 years old, which is pretty mad, I know, but yeah, that's just my story.
That's phenomenal. And then from there, Zorro, how did things progress? I mean, was it a natural progression in terms of you've got this newfound love for vehicles or this wanting to explore the world? Was that a natural progression to the next step in terms of purchasing another vehicle at a legal age, I'm assuming?
Yes, I so part of my personality is number one, I'm just a confident individual, always have been. It's been in me. I try things. I don't really fear I don't fear risk of anything. I don't see the downside of things, maybe to my own detriment sometimes. Obviously, as I'm older, I'm less riskier. But back then, I was quite risky in my approach to life, and coupled with that, I used to get quite bored. So with the Fiat Punto, which lasted, I think I had it for about a year or so, and then even when I was 15, I actually bought a different car. So I sold the Fiat Punto and I bought another car illegally. I actually bought my first car legally when I passed my driving license at the age of 19. But up until 19, between 14 and 19, I guess, I think I owned two or three different cars. So I had the Fiat Punto, and then I think I had a kind of a basic Rover, like a Rover 5 or something similar, and a Ford Escort. These were like base models, not anything too fancy. But when I passed my test at the age of 19 and I was more on a straight and narrow path in life, I actually moved town, moved city, started a proper job, and stopped doing any kind of illegal activities. I bought, and then I passed my driving test, and I bought my first car, which was actually a Renault Megane. So it was the older model, quite an old model, a P-Reg, what we call in the UK. So what's that, like 1998 or something model, something around that
Yeah.
time. Red Renault Megane. And the reason I bought it, I'd never driven a Megane or I'd never had no inclination, was purely based on looks. It was the best looking car I could get, I thought, for that kind of money at that moment in time. So I was all about look good first and win second. So it was never about engine and performance. It was about how it made me feel as I was driving the cars, and especially being a young man of 19, I wanted to go out and meet ladies and so on and so forth. So I seen it as a status symbol and how it made me feel. And driving that Renault Megane for me was great. But because I was so green, I remember that the oil light came on, like it was running low on oil or whatever. And I didn't pay any attention to it. I just thought it was like a fuel, like a low fuel thing where I thought, well, if you ignore it, it will kind of go away. Lo and behold, I left it for like a month or two and the engine seized up. So I had to scrap that car in the end because I basically didn't deal with that issue at the time like an idiot. But again, you live and you learn. But I was a bit of an idiot at the time. But I remember I was purely buying cars on their looks and purely to be able to attract women and
No, I think you touched on something that's quite relevant, Zorro, is that a vehicle obviously needs to talk to you, look the part. I mean, at the moment, a lot of individuals would go and purchase vehicles. Car enthusiasts will go and purchase vehicles based obviously on performance of the vehicle, 0 to 100 time. It becomes, they go to a pub and it just becomes a bragging right in terms of, oh, my vehicle can do 0 to 100 in X amount of time. But again, people that are not real car enthusiasts will also, I mean, to a certain extent, I'm one of those individuals where just the look of a vehicle absolutely mesmerizes me. It could be as slow as a donkey, but the look of the vehicle really stands out. And of course, in some other cars, it's also when you drive the vehicle, how it talks back to you. You don't have to be riding the vehicle or driving the vehicle at 1,000,000 miles per hour, but just the way it feels going into a bend. You don't have to take it all the way to the red line. It's just the feel of that vehicle. Yeah. So
yeah,
based on that,
I think. Sorry, go on, Janine. Yeah, so I was just going to say, I absolutely agree. So I think as I've got older, I've understood more about cars and specs and such, and I have driven some amazing cars, and we'll come on to that a bit later. But I remember back then, it was all about, for me, it was about how it made me look, how it made me feel, and how I associate some of them cars. They weren't the best cars, Renault Megane. I had a Civic Type R, which was quite a nice car to drive, actually. A BMW 5 Series, BMW 1 Series, had a couple of Corsas and Golf Mark 5, which is probably my overall favorite car. But I remember I associate memories to the car. I associate what I was doing at the time and where I was going, if I was driving to a place or I had a new partner at the time. I remember the cars along with that memory. So it gives me a sense of emotion associated to the car. In my adult life, more so the recent years, I've driven and owned much fancier cars, much more in the space of, top spec cars and really fast and V6, V8, V12 type engines. And that's been all great. And that's all about specs and speeds. And I've done track days and I've done a single seater race. And that's all well and good. But I don't have the same sense of emotion in the past 5 or 6 years to some of them cars as I do to the cars almost 20 years ago, right? So, the list of cars I owned in only a 4-year span was the Renault Megane. Two of them actually, the older model, newer model, BMW 5 Series, 1 Series. I had a Honda Civic Type R, a couple of Ford Fiestas, and a couple of Vauxhall Corsas, right? So these were pretty standard cars at the time, I guess, bar the BMWs. A lot of them were British kind of brands, if you like, not so much German, some French brands in there as well. So I wasn't too precious about the brand. It was all for me, the look, how it made me feel, and at that moment, really what I could get my hands off for that type of money. So I was obviously selling and buying cars, secondhand cars, and kind of upgrading where I could, but I wasn't, I didn't have a huge amount of money back then. So it was all about buying within my remit, really.
No, able to, like you said, you went racing in a single seater. You've able to afford V12s, V8s, these bigger, more luxurious cars. So clearly there was some progression in your life to attain those vehicles. So can you talk me through what that progression on your side looked like?
Yeah, as you know, Junaid, I'm writing a book about this at the moment, which hopefully will eventually be available to your listeners and everyone else out there in a few months. But essentially, as I mentioned, I grew up in a very poor council estate part of the UK in Lancashire in the north of England. I actually left home quite young. I don't have much of a family to speak about. So I left home when I was like 14, 15, around about the time I bought my first car, as it happens. I was homeless at a stage in life. I did a lot of bad things to get by. Eventually found my way into a normal job, a normal life in a corporate career, but I decided to set up my own business within IT, and then I set up another business in the property world. So I went from basically having no education, pretty bad background, no family, I was homeless. I had no friends, no family, no money, no roof over my head at a point in my life, to then essentially being self-employed and I guess semi-retired a few years ago, traveling the world. So it was very much a 0 to 100 type story. But along with that came, along with having some money and then eventually a bit more than some money, I was able to afford nicer things like nicer cars, nicer places to live, nicer holidays and such. So hence my car journey slightly changed, and I started actually. I'll tell you a quick short story. So when I set up my first business, I was 25 years old. So it was around about 12, 13 years ago. And up until that point, I'd never had any money. I was living paycheck to paycheck, like, most people are. It's the norm, really, especially in the UK. A lot of people don't have. And again, by Western standards, I was poor, right? And not by Eastern standards or some other parts of the world. But when I set up my first business and I got my first kind of big paycheck, I'd never had that kind of money in my life, like ever. And for me, it was like winning the lottery. It was like 5 times what would be an average wage in the UK, which is a ridiculous amount of money. So, and I always wanted to drive a really, really nice car. So the first thing I did on my first pay packet is I rented an Aston Martin DB12 for a long weekend, right? And oh no, it was an Aston Martin DBS, sorry, a DBS.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Aston Martin
Yes,
DBS?
yes, yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's an unbelievable car, unbelievable car. But at this point, I'd be driving my BMWs, my Corsas, etc. I'd owned a Mercedes CLK convertible, a 2 liter, which was quite nice, but it wasn't anywhere in the same league as an Aston Martin. And I remember I rented it for a long weekend, and I went to visit everyone I knew, right? So everyone I knew in every city in the UK. I was driving around to the Midlands, to the north, from London. I lived in London at the time, and taking people on joyrides and whatever it was. But I remember that for me was a sign of success, really. It wasn't about the money per se. It was about the obviously the lifestyle it can give you, but the comfort I could feel in doing the things that I really wanted to do. So as I was getting into my early 20s, you'd always scroll on car websites or Auto Trader in the UK, and you'd look at cars and you think, oh, I'd love to drive that one day, or I'd love to own that one day. And that was starting to become a reality. I always think money just gives you freedom, essentially, and it gave me the freedom and the option to be able to rent an Aston Martin for a long weekend without even worrying about it. So I had a trend for a couple of years of trying out different cars, because eventually I wanted to buy like a super duper car and I didn't know which one. So I was trying out like Aston Martins, Bentley Continental GT, and some other kind of like really, really nice cars, just to figure out one day when I was going to make the purchase, what do I want to buy? So almost like a try before you buy, because if you buy a car, you don't know how it's going to make you feel. You don't really know the performance. So, you go out and you try it. But generally, when you go on test drives, it's only a short run. So I thought, well, why don't I have cars for a long weekend so I can feel practically what's it like to load my golf clubs into the boot, or shopping, or go over speed bumps, things you don't think about when you're on a test drive from a garage, because you go down a designated route and it might be pretty easy. You can open it up on certain straights, but you can't do the practical things. As I'm getting older, I'm getting more practical rather than just thinking about the excitement and joy and how it makes me feel. It's about the practicalities of owning the car.
No, absolutely spot on. I think that's a very, very excellent way of trialing a vehicle. Like you said, try before you buy. And if you've got the ability to do so, why not? But man, I'm just, when you related the story to me, I'm just trying to think how the expression on your face, the emotions that were associated from going from all intents purposes, a small hatchback to a V12 Aston Martin, the power, the emotion, the luxury, because I mean, an Aston Martin is that, it's opulence, to go from a vehicle that didn't have it to a vehicle that does have it. So yeah, I'm just trying to picture your expression, that the massive smile that probably popped up on your face going from town to town. So yeah,
Yeah.
those are the things I'm thinking about, that's going through my mind.
Yeah, no, it was amazing. Look, back then as well, I was a lot different as a human. You know, I was a lot more flashy, I guess, because I was a bit more cockier because of the world I grew up in. It was all about status and image. And I remember when I had the car, I actually wore a suit just to drive the car. So I remember I wore sunglasses, the suit, and everything. And this was like early summer, I guess late spring in the UK, so it wasn't the hottest, but it was a convertible, so I had the roof down on the motorway and everything. Because for me, it was a moment of saying, well, I felt like I made it. So and all my world then was about status and showing people, and it is different now. But back then I was young, and that's the mindset I had. So I was wearing a suit and sunglasses, and I basically lived in the same suit and sunglasses for like 4 days straight. So everyone I'd go visit, they'd see me and I had a big smile on my face. And look at me, look, I've arrived, look, I've made it. Life is awesome. And it was, I still had my own struggles. Not everything was perfect, but I was on an upward trajectory, and that was like the first kind of sign for me. And it felt really, really good to be able to do something like that, being able to afford that kind of car for a long weekend, and then eventually knowing I could buy said car, what was an amazing achievement for me because of my background, where I came from. So it was almost like I don't know, a sign of it was a sign to everyone else, really, saying, look, I've made it. And I hadn't, it was very much my first paycheck, being self-employed. But I guess it was just visiting all the people who'd also helped me along to that point in life. I had a interesting journey, as I mentioned, and I had people who I really appreciated, who supported me through that difficult patch of my life. And taking them out for a meal and picking up in the car, it was a lot more than the car. It was more about everything that it represented at that point in life. And yeah, that gave me so much joy at the time. I remember dropping it off, and I was absolutely gutted that I had to drop it off on the Monday, I think, morning in central London. Funny story, when I picked it up, I'd never rented a supercar at all at that point. I'd rented like really basic cars, as and when needed on holidays or whatever. And when I picked it up, you have to put like a big deposit down, a huge deposit, and sign whatever you need to sign. But the biggest thing they said is any damages or whatever you'd pay for. And it was like, okay, no problem. But because I wasn't being particularly careful, I burnt out all four tires on the Aston Martin. And the front splitter, I guess it's called a splitter, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a super nerd. I'm not a super geeky car enthusiast. So forgive me for your listeners who are frothing at the mouth at my terminology. But the front splitter, I kept scratching on speed bumps, because talking about practicalities, if you've never driven a supercar or a car that's quite lowered in the UK, there's a lot of speed bumps and a lot of road, and I wasn't particularly careful, so I'd scratched the front splitter. So when I went back, they billed me an extra £5,000 in the UK. I don't know what that is in rand, but it's a lot of money. So on top of the rental, I had to pay an extra 5,000, but I was worth every penny for that experience and how I felt. I would have happily paid double that.
Definitely inspired me, and I'm sure the viewers as well, people listening in, would definitely inspire them to go on and achieve a lot more in life. So thank you so much for sharing, the story so far. So